Detective Rebecca Walsh felt the weight of 40 years pressing down on her shoulders as she stood outside the modest ranch house on Maple Street, watching the crime scene technicians prepare their equipment in the fading October light. The house belonged to Thomas Henley, 73 years old, who had been the Patterson family's closest friend since 1983. The same year, 9-year-old Katie Patterson and her 6-year-old brother Danny had vanished from their backyard while playing hide-and-seek. For 4 decades, Henley had comforted the grieving parents, attended memorial services, and helped organize annual search efforts, all while the children he had taken remained hidden beneath his feet. The discovery had come about through pure chance, the kind of accident that made veteran investigators question how many other secrets lay buried in plain sight. A burst water pipe in Henley's basement had required emergency repairs, and when the plumber's camera snake revealed an inconsistency in the foundation wall, building inspectors had been called to assess potential structural damage. What they found instead was a carefully constructed hidden room, accessible only through a concealed panel behind the furnace, containing evidence of long-term habitation and 2 sets of human remains that had been there for decades. Walsh had been reviewing the Patterson case files just 3 months earlier as part of the department's cold case digitization project. The original investigation had been thorough by 1983 standards, involving state police, FBI agents, and hundreds of volunteers who had searched every inch of Pine Valley and the surrounding forest. The prevailing theory had been stranger abduction. Katie and Danny had simply vanished while playing in their fenced backyard, with no witnesses, no ransom demands, and no physical evidence left behind. Thomas Henley had been questioned during the initial investigation, as had every adult male within a 5-mile radius of the Patterson home. He had provided a solid alibi. He had been at work at the Pine Valley hardware store until 6 p.m. on the day the children disappeared, with time cards and witness statements to support his claim. More importantly, he had been James and Susan Patterson's closest friend, someone they trusted implicitly, and who had immediately joined the search efforts when the children were discovered missing. Walsh studied the crime scene photographs that had been taken earlier that day, trying to reconcile the horrible reality with everything she knew about this case. The hidden room measured approximately 8 by 12 feet, with a ceiling height of just over 6 feet. It had been meticulously constructed with soundproofing materials, ventilation systems, and amenities that suggested long-term planning. Most disturbing of all, the room contained children's belongings dating from the 1980s through the early 2000s. Toys, clothing, books, and personal items that painted a picture of lives lived in captivity. The forensic anthropologist's preliminary examination of the remains had confirmed Walsh's worst fears. The bone structure and dental evidence were consistent with children who had died in their early teens, suggesting that Katie and Danny had lived in captivity for several years before their deaths. Dr. Elizabeth Moreno, the county's chief medical examiner, estimated that the children had been approximately 13 and 10 years old at the time of their deaths, though precise determination would require more extensive analysis. Walsh's phone buzzed with a text from her partner, Detective Kevin Martinez, who was conducting interviews with Henley's neighbors. The messages were brief but revealing. Mrs. Henderson says she sometimes heard children's voices from Henley's house during the day when he should have been at work. Thought it was TV or radio. Mr. Kowalski noticed Henley buying unusual amounts of groceries for a single man. Both describe him as helpful, quiet, never caused any problems. The pattern that emerged from the neighborhood canvassing was disturbingly familiar to Walsh, who had worked child predator cases for over 15 years. Henley had been the perfect neighbor, helpful, but not intrusive, friendly but respectful of boundaries, always willing to lend a hand but never overly involved in community affairs. He had maintained his lawn immaculately, paid his bills on time, and never caused any disturbances that might draw unwanted attention to his property. What made the case particularly heartbreaking was Henley's continued relationship with the Patterson family throughout the decades. James Patterson had died of a heart attack in 2018, but Susan Patterson, now 71, had remained close to Henley until his recent hospitalization for pneumonia. Henley had attended James's funeral, had brought Susan casseroles during her recovery from hip surgery, and had spent countless evenings listening to her talk about the children she had never stopped missing. Walsh drove to Shady Oaks Nursing Home that evening to interview Susan Patterson, dreading the conversation that would destroy whatever peace the woman had managed to find after 4 decades of grief. Susan sat in her wheelchair beside the window of her room, her white hair carefully styled and her hands folded in her lap. Despite her age and recent struggles with mobility, her eyes remained sharp and alert, the eyes of someone who had spent 40 years hoping for answers about her missing children. "Susan, I need to tell you something about Katie and Danny," Walsh began, settling into the chair beside the window. She had delivered terrible news to families countless times, but this felt different, not just because of the time that had passed, but because of the betrayal that would compound the tragedy. Susan Patterson listened in silence as Walsh explained the discovery at Thomas Henley's house. Her face remained composed until Walsh mentioned that the children appeared to have lived in captivity for several years before their deaths. At that point, Susan's careful composure cracked, and tears began streaming down her cheeks as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. "He was at our house for dinner every Sunday," Susan whispered, her voice barely audible. "He helped us search for them. He held me when I cried. He was at every memorial service, every birthday we marked for them. How could he look at me knowing what he had done?" Walsh had no answer to that question, though she suspected it would haunt her long after the case was closed. The depth of Henley's deception was staggering. Not just the initial crime, but the sustained psychological cruelty of maintaining a friendship with the victim's parents while their children remained hidden in his basement. It suggested a level of calculated sadism that went far beyond opportunistic crime. The investigation into Henley's background revealed a man who had lived an apparently unremarkable life while concealing secrets that stretched back decades. He had worked at Pine Valley Hardware for 37 years, earning a reputation as a reliable employee who rarely took sick days and never caused any workplace problems. His personnel file contained commendations for customer service and perfect attendance awards, painting the picture of a model citizen. But deeper investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies in Henley's personal history. He had moved to Pine Valley in 1982, claiming to be a widower whose wife had died in a car accident in Michigan. However, attempts to verify this story had found no records of a marriage or death certificate matching Henley's claims. His Social Security number had been issued in 1978, suggesting he had constructed his identity as an adult rather than maintaining records from childhood. Detective Martinez's research into Henley's previous addresses led to a disturbing discovery in Lansing, Michigan, where police records showed that 2 children had disappeared from a neighborhood where Henley had lived in 1981. The cases had never been solved, and the families had eventually moved away after years of fruitless searching. The pattern suggested that Katie and Danny Patterson might not have been Henley's first victims. Walsh coordinated with Michigan State Police to arrange for ground-penetrating radar examination of properties where Henley had lived before moving to Pine Valley. The technology that had revealed the hidden room in his current house might uncover evidence of additional crimes committed decades earlier. The investigation was expanding from a single cold case to a potential serial abduction scenario that could span multiple states and decades. The medical examiner's detailed analysis of the remains found in Henley's house provided both answers and additional disturbing questions. The children had died approximately 15 to 20 years earlier, suggesting they had been held captive from 1983 until the late 1990s or early 2000s. Evidence of healed fractures and dental work indicated they had received some medical care during their captivity, though it was unclear whether Henley had sought professional treatment or had attempted to provide care himself. Most troubling was evidence that the children had been educated during their captivity. The hidden room contained textbooks, workbooks, and educational materials spanning elementary through middle school levels. The books showed extensive use, with handwritten notes and exercises completed in childish handwriting that had gradually matured over the years. Henley had apparently maintained the pretense of normal childhood development, even while holding the children prisoner. Analysis of the room's construction revealed the extent of Henley's planning and preparation. The hidden space had been built during the home's original construction in 1979, 3 years before Henley moved to Pine Valley and 4 years before Katie and Danny disappeared. This suggested that Henley had been planning to abduct children from the moment he arrived in the community, carefully establishing himself as a trusted member of the neighborhood while preparing for his crimes. The soundproofing was sophisticated enough to prevent detection even by visitors to the main house. The room was accessed through a panel that appeared to be part of the furnace housing, camouflaged so effectively that even trained building inspectors had missed it during routine safety inspections over the years. The ventilation system drew air from the house's main HVAC system, while maintaining negative pressure that prevented sounds from escaping. Walsh interviewed Henley's co-workers from Pine Valley Hardware, seeking to understand how he had managed to maintain a normal public persona while committing such horrific crimes. The picture that emerged was of a man who was universally regarded as helpful and reliable, though several colleagues mentioned that he had always declined invitations to social events and had never discussed his personal life in detail. Tom was the kind of guy you could count on, explained Harold Brennan, who had worked alongside Henley for over 20 years. If a customer needed something special ordered or had a complicated project, Tom would stay late to help them figure it out. But he never talked about himself much. We all figured he was still grieving his wife and didn't want to pry. The investigation revealed that Henley had used his position at the hardware store to acquire materials for constructing and maintaining the hidden room. Purchase records showed regular buying of soundproofing materials, ventilation components, and specialized tools that would have been necessary for the room's construction and upkeep. The purchases had been spread across several years and mixed in with legitimate business needs, making the pattern nearly impossible to detect without specific suspicion. Walsh's team also discovered evidence that Henley had been monitoring the Patterson family and other neighborhood children for years before the abduction. Hidden cameras had been installed in trees around the Patterson property, disguised as birdhouses and weather monitoring equipment. The cameras had been positioned to observe the children's play patterns and to identify opportunities when they would be alone and vulnerable. The cameras had long since stopped functioning, but their existence suggested a level of premeditation that chilled Walsh to the bone. Henley hadn't simply taken advantage of an unexpected opportunity. He had systematically studied his targets, learning their routines and identifying the optimal moment to strike. The hide-and-seek game that had provided cover for the abduction had been observed and planned for weeks in advance. Physical evidence from the hidden room included journals that Henley had apparently required the children to keep during their captivity. The notebooks contained heartbreaking entries written in Katie's and Danny's handwriting, documenting their daily lives in the underground prison. The early entries showed confusion and terror, but later writings revealed how the children had gradually adapted to their circumstances while never losing hope of eventual rescue. "Today, Tom let us watch a movie after we finished our math homework," read one entry from Katie's journal, dated approximately 2 years after the abduction. "It was about a family that goes on a camping trip. I remember when we went camping with Mom and Dad. I wonder if they still think about us. Tom says they moved away and don't want us anymore, but I don't think that's true." The journals revealed Henley's manipulation tactics in disturbing detail. He had told the children that their parents had abandoned them, that the outside world was dangerous, and that he was protecting them from harm. He had created elaborate stories about their parents' alleged rejection while positioning himself as their savior and protector. The psychological abuse had been as systematic and calculated as the physical imprisonment. Walsh found herself struggling with the emotional weight of reading the children's words, seeing their gradual loss of hope documented in their own handwriting. The journals showed how Katie had tried to protect her younger brother, taking punishment meant for him and creating games to distract him from their horrible reality. Her final entries, written shortly before her death, showed a teenager who had never stopped loving her parents despite years of psychological manipulation. The investigation expanded when forensic accountants discovered that Henley had been receiving regular cash payments from an unknown source throughout his years in Pine Valley. Bank records showed monthly deposits of $2,000 to $3,000 that couldn't be explained by his hardware store salary. The payments had continued until 2019, suggesting they might be connected to his crimes rather than legitimate income. Tracing the source of the payments led investigators to a disturbing network of individuals who had been paying to view images and videos of the captive children. Henley had been documenting his crimes and selling access to the material through encrypted networks that predated modern internet security. The investigation revealed that Katie and Danny's suffering had been exploited not just by their captor, but by dozens of individuals who had paid to witness their abuse. The scope of the network forced Walsh to coordinate with federal authorities and international law enforcement agencies. The images and videos Henley had created had been distributed worldwide, creating victims beyond just Katie and Danny. The investigation identified buyers in multiple countries who had paid for access to the material, leading to arrests and prosecutions that would continue for years. Thomas Henley died in the hospital before he could be formally charged with the crimes investigators had uncovered. His pneumonia had progressed to sepsis while Walsh's team was still processing evidence from his house, and he died without ever confessing to his crimes or providing information that might have helped other victims. His death left many questions unanswered and denied closure to the families who had been searching for answers for decades. The discovery at Henley's house led to a comprehensive review of missing children cases throughout the region. Ground-penetrating radar revealed additional burial sites at 2 properties where Henley had lived before moving to Pine Valley, confirming that Katie and Danny had not been his only victims. The total number of children he had abducted and murdered over his criminal career would likely never be fully known. Susan Patterson's reaction to the final revelations about her children's fate was more complex than Walsh had expected. The elderly woman expressed relief at finally knowing what had happened to Katie and Danny, but she struggled with guilt over her friendship with their killer. She had trusted Henley completely, had confided in him about her grief, and had accepted his comfort while he concealed the truth about her children's suffering. "I keep thinking about all the times he sat at our kitchen table," Susan told Walsh during their final interview. "He would listen to me talk about missing them, and he would tell me not to give up hope. He knew exactly where they were the whole time. He knew what he had done to them, and he still looked me in the eye and pretended to care." The case generated national media attention when details of Henley's decades-long deception became public. The story of a family friend who had hidden his victims while comforting their parents resonated with communities across the country, leading to increased scrutiny of cold cases involving missing children. Police departments nationwide reported receiving tips about suspicious neighbors and family friends who had exhibited similar patterns of behavior. The Pine Valley community struggled to process the revelation that someone they had trusted for 40 years had been hiding such horrific crimes. Many residents reported feeling unsafe in their own neighborhood, questioning their ability to recognize danger and protect their families. The local elementary school implemented new security procedures and expanded background check requirements for all volunteers and employees. Katie and Danny Patterson were finally laid to rest in a ceremony attended by hundreds of community members who had never stopped hoping for their safe return. Susan Patterson, despite her advanced age and health problems, insisted on speaking at the service. Her words about the children's memory and her gratitude for finally knowing the truth provided a measure of healing for a community that had been traumatized by 4 decades of uncertainty. The investigation's impact extended beyond Pine Valley, as other law enforcement agencies began reviewing their own cold cases with fresh perspective. The Henley case demonstrated how predators could hide in plain sight by establishing themselves as trusted community members while systematically abusing that trust to commit horrific crimes. Training programs for investigators began incorporating lessons learned from the case, emphasizing the importance of looking beyond obvious suspects and considering the possibility of long-term deception. Walsh retired from law enforcement 6 months after closing the Patterson case, but she continued to work as a consultant on missing children investigations. The emotional toll of discovering Katie and Danny's fate, combined with the knowledge that their suffering could have been prevented if investigators had looked more carefully at everyone with access to the family, had convinced her that she needed to step back from active police work. The house on Maple Street was demolished after investigators finished processing it for evidence. The property was eventually converted into a memorial garden dedicated to Katie and Danny Patterson and other victims of child predators. The garden included a playground designed to be visible from all directions, ensuring that children playing there would always be in view of protective adults. Susan Patterson lived for another 2 years after her children's remains were found, passing away peacefully in her sleep at Shady Oaks Nursing Home. She had spent her final months working with victim advocacy groups to establish support services for families of missing children, using her experience to help others navigate the impossible combination of hope and despair that characterizes such cases. The Patterson case files were eventually incorporated into the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit training materials, serving as an example of how predators could exploit positions of trust to avoid detection while committing serial crimes. The case highlighted the importance of considering all possible suspects, regardless of their apparent relationship to victims or their standing in the community. Dr. Elizabeth Moreno's forensic analysis of the evidence from Henley's house contributed to research on identifying signs of long-term captivity in deceased victims. Her findings helped develop protocols for examining remains that might show evidence of prolonged imprisonment, potentially assisting in future cases where victims had been held for extended periods before their deaths. The encrypted network that Henley had used to distribute images of his victims became the subject of ongoing federal investigation that led to arrests of predators worldwide. The case demonstrated how early internet technologies had been exploited by criminals to create international networks for sharing illegal material, providing insight that helped law enforcement agencies develop better strategies for investigating online crimes against children. Walsh often reflected on the cruel irony that Katie and Danny Patterson had been hidden just 8 blocks from their family home, close enough that their voices might have carried on quiet nights if not for Henley's sophisticated soundproofing. The children had spent years hoping for rescue while their parents searched desperately in all the wrong places, never suspecting that their trusted friend was the person who had destroyed their family. The case served as a sobering reminder that evil could flourish behind masks of respectability and kindness, that the most dangerous predators were often those who worked hardest to earn their victims' trust. Thomas Henley had spent 40 years perfecting his deception, attending memorial services for children he had murdered while accepting the gratitude of parents whose lives he had destroyed. The memorial garden that replaced Henley's house became a place of healing for the Pine Valley community, but it also served as a warning about the dangers that could hide in plain sight. The inscription on the memorial plaque honored Katie and Danny's memory while acknowledging the harsh lesson their case had taught, that the greatest threats to children often came not from strangers but from those who had earned the right to be trusted. Walsh's final report on the Patterson case concluded with recommendations for improved missing children protocols that emphasized the importance of treating every adult with access to victims as a potential suspect, regardless of their apparent relationship or community standing. The report noted that Henley's success in avoiding detection had relied on investigators' natural reluctance to suspect someone who appeared to be a grieving family friend. The case had revealed how predators could exploit not just their victims but entire communities, using the trust and sympathy of neighbors to create elaborate covers for their crimes. Thomas Henley had turned the Patterson family's grief into a weapon against them, using their desperation for answers to maintain access to information about the investigation, while ensuring that suspicion never fell on him. The discovery of Katie and Danny's remains had finally provided answers to questions that had haunted Pine Valley for 4 decades, but it had also raised disturbing new questions about how many other Thomas Henleys might be hiding in communities across the country. The case served as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people were those who worked hardest to appear safe, and that true evil often wore the mask of friendship and compassion.